Tonight, our main speaker is Sara. Help me welcome Sara.
Hi, I'm Sara, I'm alcoholic. I wore my tallest shoes tonight because this is a podium, which is very intimidating. But thank you for being here tonight. It's really, I have butterflies and my heart's going fast, but it's really amazing to just see so many people in this room that are trying to get well at some degree. And yeah, I also want to thank Matt because that was awesome, and I feel a little intimidated because I'm certainly not as relaxed, but I'll get there. It was also really amazing to see all the folks pick up chips tonight. I go to several meetings, and it's not always that there's so much chip taking and so much energy around that. So congratulations if you picked up a chip tonight. I couldn't help but notice that it kind of dwindles off as time goes on. And I know that that's not by accident. So it was really, congratulations, John, on 23 years, because that provides a lot of hope for me, certainly. And I didn't actually pick up a chip until I was 9 months sober. So it's kind of emotional for me to just see that kind of courage, because I didn't have that. I was totally shut down in Alcoholics Anonymous, sitting in the back, crying or not, leaving the meeting or not, just really kind of 1 foot in, because I knew that I really wanted to get sober, and I really wanted to be well, and I really wanted to hold on to it. But I was also 1 foot out, because I still had ego and issues around saying I'm Sara, I'm alcoholic, and just owning that as what my problem was, and owning Alcoholics Anonymous as what the solution was for me. That was such a challenge, and it was later described to me that I had been dry for 9 months, which is totally different from being sober. And I didn't know there was a difference, but it's for me, at least, it's the difference between having a spiritual program of action, this program, and just not drinking. And I would be lying if I said I don't go through periods where I'm just holding on to that dryness. So when I share my sobriety date, yes, I haven't picked up a drink since March 13th, 2014. For those that I do math, I sit there and, yeah, so that's 5 years. And I got sober when I was, or dry, I guess, based on my previous explanation. But when I was 25, I look like I'm maybe, yes, thank you. I was going to say 16, but so I like to share that because, I don't know, I used to watch speakers, and I'd be picking apart their appearance. I'd be like, oh, what's their job, or how old are they, or where are they from? And so I like to just share that so you don't have to be distracted by trying to figure it out. And so that 5-year period in Alcoholics Anonymous has had a lot of different iterations, but I will kind of return to just what it was like and kind of how I got here before I get into some of that. So really grateful to be here, and anytime I'm in front of a group of people, whether it's this formal or whether it's just sharing at a meeting, at the beginning of the meeting, I like to take that time when we say the Serenity Prayer. A lot of the time there's a pause before the prayer, and there's a pause at the end of the meetings before the prayer that we say at the end. And I really like to use those pauses to not just pray for the alcoholics in my life that I know of that are sick and suffering, but all of the alcoholics that are sick and suffering that I'm not aware of, because I'm a firm believer that part of how I got here had nothing to do with my actions, and it had so much to do with the grace of God, but I mean, I'm not a particularly religious person, so that makes me feel kind of uncomfortable, although I recognize it like as some sort of higher power that helped direct me here. And I connect that to those prayers, like that we do all the time, like around the world, it's happening all the time. And that amazes me that like somehow maybe that energy helped bring me here. So I like to take that moment to pause, but I also like to use that pause to really remember where I came from. And that's when we talk about like sharing our experience, it's like those war stories or like those feelings, like those were all I could relate to in the beginning. Like all I wanted to hear was war stories. I didn't really want you to get up here and talk about how spiritual you were and how your life got better. I really wanted to just like hear something that would click with how I was feeling and some sort of experience that might describe something that I had recently gone through. So I won't go into too many gory details, I guess, but I do just want to extend that if that's kind of where you're at, I love to get coffee, and so do many people in this room, and like that's a really good time to maybe share some of those more intimate details about like where we've been and where we've come from. Because in my experience, like the more stories I've heard, the more like pings that have gone up, and that happens even today, where it's like I continue to identify as an alcoholic because of other people's stories, and sometimes from places that I don't expect them. One of my first meetings, I remember he was in a motorcycle gang, was talking about being in and out of jails, and he was sharing this experience about like getting hosed down, you know, when you enter, and just how humiliating that was and powerless. And I remember thinking like, man, I have never had that experience, but I've had that exact experience in a very different way. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's like I wouldn't expect to hear that coming from someone that is so different on the outside than I am. But the one thing we had in common is we were alcoholic, and that's why I was able to hear that. So I started drinking when I was 14. I had small sips when I was a kid, but I don't really remember any of that. I come from a alcohol-loving family. It's a very like central part. And I grew up in a multi-generational house, so I had my grandparents. At one time I had, you know, my aunt and uncle, I had my parents, I had my brothers. And so there was a lot of dynamics going on in that house. And I loved Matt's story about his first drink or first drunk or whatever. Mine was similar in that like I totally had this feeling of not being comfortable in my skin growing up. I thought everybody else was stupid because I have a huge ego. So I always felt like people my age were just like dumb, and like adults were really cool, but they were also like somehow separate, and like I didn't know who I was, which I don't. Let's be real, like I don't know that that's necessarily unique to alcoholics, but the point is that I didn't go through a period where that started getting better. It just got worse. And when I was drinking, including my first drunk, it was like Sarah had turned on, you know, like I had become myself. And I felt like I was having fun. I also felt like I was free to talk and express myself in ways that I never did when I wasn't drinking. Like I was totally reserved and held back. And so that is a huge dose of freedom. And I did black out on my first drunk too. I was drinking, we pilfered from the liquor cabinet, which because of my multi-generational house, there were like 3 liquor cabinets, which was awesome, because I could take from here, and then I could go over to the grandparents' side of the house, take from there, then I could go over to the aunt and uncle, take from there. It was like, alcohol wasn't really, like, getting it really wasn't a problem for me, really, until I was like 18. That's when it got hard. But so it was relatively easy. I remember we were drinking, we mixed all the things together, but one of the key components was slow gin, which is like dark and disgusting, but it was fine. And I never returned to that. I became a gin drinker later, but never, anyway. So that night I did black out, and blackouts are a big part of my story. Because it's not that I blacked out every time I drank, but I certainly, that was like a regular weekly occurrence, because I never had an off switch. Even from that first time, there was never an off switch. There might be a couple days, and especially when I was younger, like I could go to school during the week. There were times where I would get drunk at school or before school or whatever, but like there were periods. But in terms of when I picked up that first drink, there was no stopping until I fell asleep, passed out. Even running out, like, wasn't really a thing. Matt was talking about drinking vomit. I remember spilling some or something and like mopping it up with the paper towels and then drinking. It's like crazy lengths to just continue that, the drinking. That was how I drank. And the not crazy thing, I think this is not unique, but I surrounded myself with people that drank with me. And it wasn't really till later, like now we're getting into like early 20s. It wasn't really till later where there was kind of like this separation where like I had this group of friends, we like spent a lot of time in basements, so I can relate to that, a lot of really dark basements. We spent a lot of time in outdoor venues, which is like basically the park or the bridge behind the house or whatever. There were cops coming, there were cars that were crashing. There were a lot of really close calls, not just like with the law and things like that, but in terms of like, you mentioned the meeting Live or Die, right? It's like, or I think that was what it was called. It's like there were close calls where people could have died or otherwise seriously had their lives fully altered. And I'm so grateful that those times, especially in cars, because drinking and driving was such a huge part of like, I was drinking when I had my permit with my parent in the car, like drinking and driving. How did that not take my life, take somebody else's life, alter things the way it does for other people? I have no idea. I have no answer for why that didn't happen to me personally, but I've seen it happen to so many of the people around me. And when I talk about that split, it's like, if you got this crew, in my case, I got this crew that we're all drinking and we're living our lives to the fullest as far as we can see it, and then at some point, certain people just like grow up. I'm still baffled by it, but it's like I don't remember the moment when some of my girlfriends were like, no, I'm going to go to bed, or no, I'm going to stay in tonight, or no, I'm actually not drinking tonight. Like I don't remember when that happened. I just remember feeling abandoned and feeling pissed. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, this is what we do. And then on the other side, there's like these folks that are around me that aren't changing. So immediately, I'm just going that direction. And so for an alcoholic who doesn't, I had been exposed to alcoholics in my life, but I had never been exposed to Alcoholics Anonymous. I was vaguely aware that it was a thing that existed and that people got well there, maybe. I don't even know. But as someone who was exposed to alcoholics, I had very little sense that maybe I could be one. Like that just wasn't any thinking. And then by surrounding myself with people that drank like me, it never had the opportunity to come up and like smack me in the face, So there were a number of years that passed where I was miserable. I was totally locked in to my lifestyle, which by the time I hit one of my lowest bottoms, which was 19, which is pretty young, in my opinion, by the time I got there, I was drinking all the way through the night into the morning, the early hours, like 6 a.m., whatever. And then I was sleeping all day. And then I would wake up and I would smoke cigarettes all the time and start drinking again. And that was the process. Occasionally I'd go into the shower to feel better, and I couldn't even stand because I'd be like shaking, and I'd have to like sit down in the shower, which is like not okay, super lightheaded. And I had never had hangovers when I was young, but now all of a sudden like my head is like splintering, and I have no self-worth because part of blackouts, but really just part of drinking heavily, is not knowing what you did can be really terrifying. Like, it's kind of funny as a teenager, oh, what did I do last night? That's crazy. Show me the pictures or whatever. But it's like once I became an adult, it wasn't funny anymore. It wasn't cool to like not know how I got home, or it wasn't cool to not know the person that I'm currently with at the moment, Like, that stuff is really scary. And all it takes is really for like one experience like that to just hit you in the face where you learn. And then it's like, how many other times has that happened? And that's what I mean when I talk about that motorcycle guy talking about, that feeling of just being totally humiliated and powerless. Like, that's the feeling that I had during that time period. However, I didn't get sober when I was 19. I did, however, fall into, I'll say, so through therapy and through other outside issues, I did fall into some period of healing, but drinking wasn't my issue as far as I was concerned. And this is where, like, I talk about the chicken and egg a lot in my story, because I knew I was like Matt had shared about starting therapy at an early age. I mean, I was the kid that went for self-harm when I was like 11 and 12, So I was very aware that that I had issues. Alcohol was not one of them. And so when I started to get well in terms of working around some of my other stuff, it just didn't seem like it. My drinking did slow down, but not for very long. It's like I got that glimpse of freedom. I got that glimpse of feeling a little bit more like myself. I kind of got out of some sort of pit, but I continued to drink. And even though I think that I was able to do that somewhat in a manageable way, when I look back at my life, the unmanageability started happening again. Not in the same, like, visceral, like, blackout type scenario, but now I'm at the point where I can't hold any relationship. And I mean, like yes, with like romantic relationships, but also like any sort of friendship. Because I'm lying through my teeth. I don't know who I am. I'm like stealing things, sometimes just to steal them. I didn't have any integrity. I had a lot of issues with my family. I will share. One time because I would get rage sometimes, and I smashed my entire grandparents' their living area. I just smashed everything in it, like their piano, all their pictures, and I couldn't even tell you why I did that. I just knew I had so much anger towards all these people, and when I would drink, that would come right to the surface. And then when I would stop drinking, I would be like, nice and kind, and try to apologize, but it didn't matter because it was still under the surface. And at a certain point, my family and those relationships around me noticed these patterns and didn't believe my bullshit anymore. So I didn't have any escape. Like, I was beyond apologizing. I was beyond, trying to make things right in that moment. And I was still drinking. And so the only way out for me, as far as I was concerned, I had this tally system. Okay. Because I mentioned I was very rage-filled. And so I had this job. It was a wonderful job, wonderful people. And every time I would get pissed off at someone or something, I would put this little tally in my notebook. And this was the period where I would drink whiskey when I was happy and gin when I was sad. So when my housemates got home from a day at work, they could instantly tell. They'd be like, oh, she's drinking gin. Let's go leave her and maybe just offer her a pack of cigarettes. And that's good, Because I couldn't get off the couch and go do those things. But I digress. So I had this tally system, and I would mark every time I was pissed off. And I told myself when I got to 15, I was gone. I was packing the car, and I had read this one sci-fi book about the West, and I was going to drive to the Red Rocks of the West, because I did have a car. And I got there. It was great. I got there. I mean, it wasn't great, but I exploded upon my boss. It's still debatable whether I got fired or whether I left. I think that I left, but in retrospect, if I didn't storm out in that moment, then I would have been fired. And I packed up my car. I did say goodbye to my family, but they were definitely like, what? And my mom in particular was super tore up about it because it was almost I don't want to be dramatic about it, but the way I felt in the moment and the way my life had moved up until that point, it was I am going out west to die right now. That is where I'm going because I have nothing left here. I have nothing to look forward to, if I have nothing left here, I have nothing in terms of a future. So it was a really emotional kind of journey. Although for me, it was very clinical. It was whatever, because my feelings are gone. So I come out west. I do end up getting a job. I promptly lost it within a couple months. But part of my story there is I started living out of my car. And I was up in Utah, and I spent a good solid 9 months just living out of my car in Utah around Salt Lake, where it was really cold. And one of my kind of God shots that I'll share is just this one. So I had lost my job. I'm going to the public library to search for a new one. And I slept in the car the night before, super cold out, -20 type deal. And I'm waiting outside this public library for it to open so that I can go inside and, I don't know, hopefully find something to do with my life. And I remember there were a couple of folks out there, most of them were men, and these guys, one of them came up to me and he's like, so are you homeless? And I'm like, no, definitely not. And he's like, oh, so do you live in town? Are you a college student or something? I'm like, no, I'm living out of my car. And he's like, well, do you have a job? And I'm like, no, I don't have one right now. I'm going to go get one, And, and he didn't, in my memory, he was like, so you're homeless. And I don't know if he exactly said it in those words, but I remember in that moment, all of a sudden I was like, whoa, maybe my life is not going the way that I somehow project it as going. And that was a huge deal for me because I knew that I wanted to change something, and I knew that Alcoholics Anonymous existed. Again, I didn't know that alcohol was my problem, although the whiskey bottles in my car could have indicated that. And the fact that, I don't want to generalize here, but for women, it's not that hard to go out drinking if you don't have money. So I would do that. That's part of what I was doing. But my car battery would not start in the cold weather. So I had, another very vivid experience at the bar where, people would not jump start my car because they're like, you're plastered. Not going to do that, And so then what choices are you left with? And it's like, frick. That's the opposite of freedom. That's the opposite of this whole westward journey. I did eventually find a job, and part of that was because the position that I found was working in wilderness therapy, which is not specifically alcohol and drug treatment, but it's para. And because of that, the person that interviewed me was a therapist, which is great, because I was able to really share where I was pretty honestly, and then she was able to share in reverse, cool, you can do this, but you can't drink, this is what this looks like. And instantly she put me in touch with folks that were also working there, that were also in recovery. And that, again, I didn't really know that was going to be my deal. I went to a meeting in Flagstaff, because, again, car living, so you can go anywhere you want to meetings. And there was a woman that got up at a podium like this, and she shared, and she said her name. She said she was from Prescott, Arizona, and she said her home group was Girly Birds. And I was like, oh, okay. Noted. But I had never been to Prescott, and but it was logged, and then I listened to her story, and that was the first time, honestly, I ever had the thought oh, that could be me, that could be me. And that was when I believe I at least took my first step, in part. And so then I went to another meeting in tiny little Kanab, Utah, which was just someone's living room, which was about 7 people. I sat there, cried the whole time. I wouldn't even say my name. I wouldn't do anything. And after the meeting, a couple of the women there, they took me aside and they're like, hey, what's going on? And I just cried some more. I told them I don't want to identify as an alcoholic because I'm more than an alcoholic. I'm a human, And I got all these human problems. And I can't, I can't just put myself in a box like that, And they're like, yeah, you'll get over it, It was really kind and loving, but it's okay, just keep coming back. And so that was really how my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous started. The cool part is I did end up in Prescott, Arizona. I went to Girly Birds my first week here, and I saw that woman, and it was amazing. But I also met many more women in the program, and men. But for me, I had to really focus, especially in women's meetings, at least at first, because I didn't know how to share my experience, strength, and hope without sharing things that were inappropriate. And I didn't know that. I had no idea, It's these things are related. But I really needed those women to help guide and shape me. And they did. Today my home group is the Tuesday night Big Book and 12 and 12 at 7 p.m. at the Methodist Church on Gurley. And a lot of those folks are here tonight, which is amazing. I always encourage folks, even for me, having a home group, but just part of my story being she shared her home group and I found her. It's really good. I like having a home group because I like being able to tell people, maybe you're not picking this stuff up now, but this is where you can find me and some other amazing people on a regular basis without fail. So that if you're feeling something later down the road or whatever, it's oh, there's a meeting at 7 p.m. on Tuesday. And apparently it's kind of good. So I do like to share that, and I do think it's really important, and getting involved, because the reality is I wouldn't go on a regular basis if I didn't have a service commitment. And service is such a huge part of Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's a lot of different ways to express it, and that's an entirely different, 45 minutes or whatever. But what I will say about that is, I was really intimidated about service because I thought it looked one way, which was sponsoring people and getting them sober. And that is just not, that is a part of it for sure, but even just going up to someone after a meeting and being like, hey, I really appreciated what you shared tonight. That's that changed my life. I had people come up and say that to me, and I'm like, holy shit, people are out there? Just realizing, or hanging around the meeting for a minute. Even if it's just sitting in your seat, maybe nobody comes and talks to you, that's okay. But that's being of service, because every time we show up is amazing, because this program doesn't work without people coming together and reaching out to each other one way or the other. And sometimes I'm a taker and sometimes I'm a giver, and especially when I was new, I was taking like crazy. So if you're in that mode, that's totally okay. But there's a lot of ways to help the people stay sober so that we get beyond those first couple months and maybe get into the years and maybe continue one day at a time to keep building that up. And the last thing I'll share, it's a silly story, but I do like to tell it because Matt and I actually talked on a panel one time, and this woman from the Navajo reservation asked a question that just has always stuck with me. She was like, so I'm leaving this treatment center, and I'm going back to the reservation, and I don't have internet, and I don't know where there are meetings, I don't have transportation, and I don't know any other alcoholics that are sober, What do I do to stay connected with Alcoholics Anonymous? And it kind of baffled me because everybody told me it's go to meetings and, go get coffee with folks and stay involved. It's what do you do when that community isn't there? And how that translates to my experience was just the moment I thought about was in my first year of sobriety. I went home for my grandmother's funeral, and I was coming back, and I was not in a good headspace, and the plane was delayed, and way delayed, sitting on the plane. Everything's building up. There was a cat involved, and people wouldn't move their seats, and it was really frustrating. And as compensation, the airline was like, all right, cool, free drinks. And I see the cart coming, I see it coming. And there have been other moments in my sobriety where I've just wanted to kind of give it up and just been like, oh, cool, I'm in, But that was one of those moments that I really felt it. And I started to panic because I knew I was supposed to use my phone, and I couldn't. And then I started to panic because I knew I was supposed to grab the big book or some literature or something, and I didn't have it, And then I started to panic because I was like, there's no freaking meeting on this plane. I'm not going to stand up and and so the only tool that I thought that I had left in my toolbox was to pray. And at that point, I really didn't know how to pray. I still don't really know if I do. I try to put things out and take things in, hopefully that's right. But I did really take a moment, and I just closed my eyes, and I just asked my higher power to help me through that moment, through that cart, and it worked. I don't know that it would always work, but I know that if I keep putting insurance away, that maybe those actions will continue to serve me in my sobriety, which allows me to be of service to others. So if you're feeling alone, or if you're feeling like none of this is working, we always have that. We always have our higher power. And that's really how I feel at this point, is just that gratitude for always being connected to Alcoholics Anonymous, no matter where I am or what I'm doing or how I'm feeling. Again, thank you so much for having me tonight. It's great to see this full room. I'm Sarah. I'm alcoholic.
Thanks, Sarah. This has been a regular meeting of the Rarely Group of Alcoholics Anonymous. You're cordially invited to join us again next week. Please bring a friend. There are approximately 100 meetings of AA each week in the Prescott area. We advise that you attend as many as possible, and we hope you'll join us again soon.